Welcome, early American literature friends. This is a video that is going to guide you through 3 chapters of Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl. Those 3 chapters are 14, 21, and 41. And 41 is the last chapter of the book. It is the concluding chapter of the book. 14 is the chapter where she has her second child. And then 21 is maybe the most famous chapter of the book. It's the chapter that people often remember because it is the hiding in her grandmother's attic chapter. You see Harriet Jacobs here. This is a famous picture of her. This picture is taken just a few years before she died in the 1890s. I don't know if you know much about the history of photography, but photography did not come to this country until the 1840s, 1850s. It was smuggled into New Orleans from France. And so Harriet Jacobs' lifespan sort of crosses that line of when she was born and when she was young, there was no photography. And then by the time you get to the end of her life, and especially after the Civil War, photography became much more popular. So a lot of the people that we have dealt with here, like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, you get photographs of them later in life because photography had become much more accessible to the average person. I'm going to jump into chapter 14 though, and we'll start there. If you remember, Harriet Jacobs, I'm also going to scroll down to this timeline because it gives us a little bit of organization here because we're going to be jumping around in time. Let me scroll down to this timeline. So her son, Joseph, who she calls Benny in the book, is born in 1829. And then her daughter is born a little more than 3 years later, in 1833, her daughter Louisa Matilda, who Joseph goes and works, takes part in the California Gold Rush, so that when you get to the last chapter in the book, he is already in California with his uncle, Harriet Jacobs' brother. Louisa Matilda, though, lives and works with Harriet Jacobs through much of the rest of her life. And what chapter 14 deals with, this is that we're in 1833 now because you're getting the birth of her daughter. Chapter 14 starts, she'd been living with her grandmother. I had not returned to my master's house since the birth of my child. That would be Benjamin, the 1829 right here. She'd been living with her grandmother. Slavery still held me in its poisonous grasp, and there was no chance for me to be respectable. There was no prospect of me being able to lead a better life. What she's transitioning here, that's the last part of the first paragraph of this chapter. What she is connecting you back to domestic fiction and appealing to women, and especially white women who would be reading this book, because she's again saying, like, I had no opportunity to keep myself pure. I'd already had one child. I already had one child out of wedlock. What she is setting you up for here is to transition from her first child out of wedlock to her second child, also with Samuel Sawyer, who she calls Mr. Sands in this book. She has Louisa Matilda. He is the father of both of the children. You get that, the third paragraph, she says, "Humble me, was I not already in the dust?" And she, although now that she has had a child, she did, if you remember, she did that to avoid being sent to the cottage that Dr. Flint had built for her. Dr. Flint has a new threat because she has a child now, because he technically owns that child. And she says, I knew the law gave him power to fulfill it, for slaveholders had been cunning enough to enact that the child shall follow the condition of the mother, not of the father, thus taking care that licentiousness, that would be sexual desire, shall not interfere with avarice. Avarice would be greed. So what she is saying is, slaveholders had this law so that they can indulge their sexual appetites, their sexually harass and rape slaves, but also then the children will be slaves as well, so they can sell them and indulge the avarice, the greed part of it. And then you get the fourth paragraph. When Dr. Flint learned that I was again to be a mother, he was exasperated beyond measure. Again, because she's having another child, she's clearly been having this ongoing sexual relationship, and he has still not been able to successfully sexually assault her. That's his exasperation. He rushed from that, and then this paragraph, you get really the only other description of physical violence that she gives you. She mentioned the first time that he hit her in an earlier chapter. One thing that's important about this chapter let me give you the description of the physical violence. He rushed from the house, returned with a pair of shears. I had a fine head of hair. He often railed about my pride of arranging it nicely. He cut every hair close to my head. This is a notable moment for her because the violence that's being done to her right here is this very particular kind of gendered violence. She's a woman, she takes pride in her hair, so he's cutting it off. It's this very sort of gendered violence. And then I replied to some of his abuse, and he struck me. Some months before, he had pitched me downstairs in a fit of passion, and the injury I received was so serious I was unable to turn myself in bed for many days. He then said, Linda, I swear by God, I'll never raise my hand against you again. But I knew he would forget his promise. She does not give you this graphic description of violence, neither the throwing down the stairs or the striking her right here, like Frederick Douglass would over and over give you those graphic descriptions of this kind of violence. She gives you as much description of him cutting her hair as she does of the actual hitting, of him actually hitting her. And it's because physical violence is just not as significant to her as the sort of gendered sexual harassment violence that she endures day after day after day. And she reinforces that when you skip down a couple of paragraphs. When they told me my newborn babe was a girl, my heart was heavier than it had ever been before. Slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women. Superadded to the burden common to all, they have wrongs and sufferings and mortifications peculiarly their own. And so she is saying, like all slaves, male, female, deal with the same kinds of difficulties, the same kinds of tortures, the same kind of troubles, whether it's labor, all the awfulness that you're familiar with slavery. But she says, they, women, female slaves, have wrongs and sufferings peculiarly their own. And that is obviously a reference to the sort of sexual harassment, sexual assault, outright rape. And so there is this really sad moment when she has a female child, a daughter, and she realizes, I've given birth to a person who's going to go through the same who could potentially go through the same struggles and difficulties that I have gone through. You get that next long chapter, next long paragraph that begins, Dr. Flint had sworn that he would make me suffer to my last day. It's a significant paragraph because she describes most back then and really up until the early 20th century, after they gave birth, it was common practice for most women to have a laying in period. It would generally be 2 weeks. You would have 2 weeks of laying in, and that essentially meant women would lay in bed most of the time and recover from giving birth, understandably, because the medical technology was nowhere near what it is and became in the early 20th century. But women would generally lay in bed and recover from the experience of giving natural birth, and that would usually last it's commonly 14 days, but at least 10 days. What she describes in this paragraph, she says, on the 4th day after the birth of my babe, Dr. Flint comes in, forces her to stand up, holding the child, is cursing at her, cussing her out. She eventually faints, and he is cursing and yelling at her until she passes out and collapses at his feet. And so you get that description of how awful he is, this sort of awful experience of her. And then the chapter ends, though, in this much happier note where on one particular Sunday, she and her grandmother, while Dr. Flint is out of town, she and her grandmother are able to take the children and have the baby girl christened at their local church, which is an important thing for her, both her and her grandmother obviously being practicing Christians, devout Christians. My grandmother belonged to the church. She was very desirous of having the children christened. I knew Dr. Flint would forbid it, but chance favored me. He was called to visit a patient out of town and was obliged to be absent during Sunday. Now is the time, said my grandmother. You also get that description when my baby was about to be christened. This is the next to last paragraph. The former mistress of my father, so the person who owned her father, stepped up to me, proposed to give it her Christian name. To this I added the surname of my father, who had himself no legal right to it. You're getting into this sort of complicated surnames and names. Most slaves simply adopted the last name, the surname of their owner, which is what her father's owner is offering to her, but then she complements that with her father's own, like his own surname. What tangled skeins are the genealogies of slavery. Much like Frederick Douglass, she is making the point that because of all the racial intermixing at this point, generations and generations of slavery here, what this does, what like the naming calls up for her, the same kinds of, you get that first in Frederick Douglass, the first chapter of his autobiography, where he talks about the slaves looking very different from the slaves in the South now, looking very different from the slaves who were brought over from Africa. She's making a similar point here. That last paragraph, she talks about how her father's owner puts a gold chain around Louisa Matilda's neck. And she obviously appreciates the gift, but does not like the symbol of the chain around her child's neck. Obviously, it symbolizes the chain symbolizing slavery. So she ends the chapter with that last little imagery. She gets the child christened, though. But the big point of this chapter is Dr. Flint is getting, like, she has her second child. She is 19, 20 years old, somewhere right in there now. Dr. Flint getting more and more frustrated with her, and that is what transitions you to chapter 21, the loophole of retreat, because this chapter skips ahead from 1833 to it's 1835 by the time you get to chapter 21. And what has happened is that with Harriet Jacobs having had 2 children at this point, Dr. Flint has never succeeded. She's gone, Harriet Jacobs has gone from 12 to 19, 20 years old at this point, maybe even 21. He has not succeeded in sexually assaulting or raping her. And he finally, after, 8 years roughly, gives up and sends her to his son's plantation, which is 5-6 miles out of town, this shared family plantation. She escapes from that plantation, hides for a while in a swamp, and then finally one night is brought back into town. And beginning in 1835 and until from 1835 to 1842, she spent 7 years hiding in the attic of her grandmother's storage shed, like where she would have stored food, but all kinds of other tools and things like that. This is the most famous chapter in the book, I think, for a lot of people, just because it's so memorable that she successfully hid in this very small attic space where she didn't even have room enough to stand up. She couldn't even completely roll over from her back to her front, so the pitch of the roof was so steep. But she succeeded in hiding there for 7 years. A small shed had been added to my grandmother's house. Some boards were laid across the joists at the top, and between these boards, the roof was a very small garret. And she tells you the garret was 9 feet long, 7 feet wide, and the highest part was 3 feet high. So you have to imagine a triangle is 3 feet high, and then you got that steep pitch of a roof. She tells you my uncle Philip, who was a carpenter, had very skillfully made a concealed trapdoor. To this hole I was conveyed. She's brought one night, brought back from the swamp. As soon as I entered the house, the air was stilling, the darkness total. A bed had been spread on the floor. I could not turn on the other without hitting the roof. So what she's saying is she can't roll over like 180 degrees without hitting the steep pitch of the roof of the attic. The rats and mice ran over my bed, but I was weary and I slept much sleep. And what you get in this chapter, she essentially describes her life in this chapter, freezing and getting frostbite in the winter, sweating and suffering in the summer, and being bit by ants and mosquitoes and no-see-ums. I suffered for air even more than light, but I was not comfortless. I heard the voices of my children. On the contrary, I had always been kindly treated, tenderly cared for until I came into the hands of Dr. Flint. I never wished for freedom till then, but though my life in slavery was comparatively devoid of hardships, like she said, she wasn't a field slave, she didn't do a lot of manual labor. God pity the woman who is compelled to lead such a life, that life of daily, constant sexual harassment, those kinds of things. She talks about how her grandmother and her uncle and aunt passed food up to her. The most notable moment here, the image that often stands out to people is, one day I hit my head against something and found it was a gimlet. If you don't know what a gimlet is, it's essentially an old-timey drill. It is how they used to drill holes for pegs. You may have seen them at old-timey yard sales or old-timey tools or something like that. Looks like it's a kind of drill that you would, has a wooden handle on one end, then you turn it. What she does, she finds the gimlet that her uncle had left in the attic, and she bores her own hole in the front of the front side of the attic, I bored 3 rows of holes, one above another. Then I bored out the interstices, that's the space between them. I thus succeeded in making one hole about an inch long and an inch broad. And so this gives her a little peephole right out onto the street, because like many old-timey houses in town, it's right on the sidewalk. And so she's looking right down on the sidewalk. The first person I saw on the street was Dr. Flint. I had a shuddering, superstitious feeling. So she bores this hole, looks out. The first person she sees is Dr. Flint. Scared, she's like, oh, this is a bad sign. But it's not. She doesn't get caught. My condition was now a little improved, because she can like sit at the hole, get a little light, get a little fresh air, look out, sort of spy on people. Through my peeping hole, I could watch the children, and when they were near enough, I could hear their talk. Aunt Nancy brought me all the news she could hear. Dr. Flint's. She describes how Dr. Flint, thinks she has escaped to the north. He goes to New York to look for her. Obviously, she's not there, can't find her. You have that scene where her son, who's called Benny in the book, says, Dr. Flint, did you bring my mother home? When he comes back from New York, I want to see her. The doctor stamped his foot at him in a rage and exclaimed, get out of the way, you little damn rascal. Benny ran terrified into the house, saying, you can't put me into jail again. And then you get autumn came with a pleasant abatement of heat, that next paragraph there. She talks about winter, like I said, and getting frostbite. And then you get in that paragraph, she says, Southerners have the habit of stopping and talking in the streets, and I heard many conversations not intended to meet my ears. And she talks about how she hears some people saying that if they catch her, they would turn her in, and other people saying they hate Dr. Flint and they wouldn't do anything to help catch her. Dr. Flint and his family, and in the last paragraph of this chapter, Dr. Flint and his family repeatedly tried to coax and bribe my children to tell something they had heard said about me, because they're obviously trying to find her. Nobody has any clue. She's, right up there in the attic, in her grandmother's attic. One day the doctor took them into a shop, bought them some bright little silver pieces and gay handkerchiefs if they would tell where their mother was. Ellen shrank away, that's the little girl, and would not speak. But Benny spoke up and said, Dr. Flint, I don't know where my mother is. I guess she's in New York. When you go there again, I wish you'd ask her to come home, for I want to see her. But if you put her in jail or tell her you'll cut her head off, I'll tell her to go right back. And so you get that sort of funny scene where her son, who's 4 or 5 years old now, tells Dr. Flint off, is like, correctly assesses the scene and understands that Dr. Flint's not a nice guy. That, like I said, though, chapter 21 is often memorable to people because you get a sense of her life. She essentially spends age 20 to 21 to 27 to 28, she spends, to the majority of her 20s hiding in this attic where she essentially can't move. It's 9 feet by 3 feet by the pitch of the roof is 7 feet. What would be like the hypotenuse of the triangle if you think of it that way. And so she describes her life there, like knitting and sewing, through the light, from the light of this 1-inch little hole, those kinds of things. And then you jump ahead to chapter 41. Chapter 41 gives you 1852. Harriet Jacobs has escaped at this point. She escapes up the coast, escapes to New York City. And what is described in chapter 41 is her life in New York City. Cornelia Willis, who she calls Mrs. Bruce in the book, she goes to work for this relatively famous writer and his wife, who is an abolitionist, who is the woman that she calls Mrs. Bruce in the book. And this chapter, the point of this chapter is that she eventually, Dr. Flint has died, and Dr. Flint's daughter, who is the person who Harriet Jacobs was originally willed to, but who was only 5 years old when she was willed to her, is now an adult and married, and the daughter's husband, who she calls Mr. Dodge in the book, comes to New York to try to recover Harriet Jacobs because they want the money for her. And that's what you get in this chapter is Harriet Jacobs' original owner's husband, and they're adults now, comes to New York trying to recover her, and the woman that she works for and who protects her, who employs her both as like a maid and as a nanny. Harriet Jacobs works for her as a maid and a nanny. Is like, I've had enough of this. We're just going to buy your freedom and be done with it. And you see right here, Mrs. Bruce and every member of her family were exceedingly kind to me. I was thankful for the blessings of my lot, yet I could not always wear a cheerful countenance because she's always worried about being hunted, being caught. You know, it'd be stressful to live this way, being anxious all the time. I could be captured in any second. I could never go out to breathe God's free air without trepidation in my heart. This seemed hard, and I could not think it was a right state of things in any civilized country. And she talks about the first thing you get. She talks about getting letters from her grandmother. She gets a letter from her grandmother letting her know that Dr. Flint has died. I received a letter from her in which she wrote, "Dr. Flint is dead. He has left a distressed family. Poor old man. I hope he made his peace with God." So Dr. Flint dies, doesn't leave a lot of money for his family, which is why his daughter and son-in-law come to New York trying to find Harriet Jacobs. And you get that. That paragraph that begins, "I remembered how he had defrauded my grandmother," and you get that there are wrongs which even the grave does not bury. The man was odious to me while he lived, and his memory is odious now. She talks about how much she hates Dr. Flint, and him dying hasn't changed her feelings. She hates him as much as she ever did. His departure from the world did not diminish my danger. This is when she transitions to the son-in-law and the daughter coming to get her. The doctor had died in embarrassed circumstances and had little to will to his heirs except such property as he was unable to grasp. I was well aware of what I had to expect from the family. I kept close watch of the newspapers for arrivals. The local newspapers used to print the names of people who arrived on ships. And so what she is watching for is she watches the arrivals on the ships when they come into New York Harbor to see if it's somebody coming to look for her, if it's one of Dr. Flint's family coming to look for her. And she says, "I forgot to examine the Evening Express as usual. I went down into the parlor for it early in the morning." So she forgets to look at it Saturday night. She comes down Sunday morning, found the boy about to kindle a fire with it. I took it from him and examined the list of arrivals. Reader, if you have never been a slave, you cannot imagine the acute sensation of suffering at my heart when I read the name of Mr. and Mrs. Dodge, Hotel in Cortlandt Street. And so she sees that they have come. She knows why they're there. They're trying to find her. Mrs. Bruce, the person that she works for, immediately sends for a carriage, and Harriet Jacobs and Mrs. Bruce's child, who she is the nanny for, she sends them away, hides them away at a neighbor, at a family friend's house. A carriage was hastily ordered. I followed Mrs. Bruce, taking the baby again with me into exile. The carriage stopped at the house of one of Mrs. Bruce's friends. She sent in Harriet Jacobs with the baby into hiding. Having the Mrs. Bruce's child would give her even more of a reason to like be traveling around, because she seems like a legitimate nanny. It would be even harder to, for them to catch her while she's caring for the baby. It was not long after Mrs. Bruce's return to her house before several people came to inquire for me. One inquired for me, another asked for my daughter Ellen, another said he had a letter from my grandmother. These are all people that the Dodges, Dr. Flint's son-in-law and daughter, have sent to try to look for her. They were told she has lived here, but she has left. This Mr. Dodge, who claimed me as his property, was originally a Yankee. She tells this story about the son-in-law, Dr. Flint's son-in-law. And so then she has a friend. I had a colored friend, a man from my native place, to whom I had the most implicit confidence. I sent for him, told him that Mr. and Mr. Dodge had arrived in New York. I proposed he should call on them. So she tries to turn the tables. She gets a friend of hers from North Carolina, goes to knock on their hotel door. He thought there was no impropriety in doing so. He went to the hotel, knocked at the door of Mr. Dodge's room, which was opened by the gentleman himself. "What brought you here? How come you didn't know I was in the city?" "Your arrival was published in the evening paper, sir. I called to ask Mrs. Dodge about my friends at home." And then the son-in-law, Mr. Dodge, immediately says, "Where's that girl that belongs to my wife?" "You know well enough, I mean Linda, that ran away from Dr. Flint's plantation." And the friend says, "She is out of your reach, sir." And they go back and forth. This made Mr. Dodge very angry. Mrs. Bruce came to me and entreated me to leave the city the next morning. She said her house was watched. It was possible that some clue to me might be obtained, but I refused to take her advice. Harriet Jacobs she says, "I was weary of flying from pillar to post." She's tired of hiding, tired of running, tired of all this. But her daughter, Ellen, who she calls Ellen in the book, and Mrs. Bruce finally work together, convince her and the baby to leave the city. They go to Boston. The next day, baby and I set out in a heavy snowstorm bound for New England again. In a few days, a letter came from Mrs. Bruce informing me that my new master was still searching for me. She intended to put an end to this persecution by buying my freedom. The idea was not so pleasant to me. Without my knowledge, Mrs. Bruce employed a gentleman in New York to enter into negotiations with Mr. Dodge. He proposed to pay $300 down, and Mr. Dodge would sell me. He who called himself my master said he scorned so small an offer. The gentleman replied, "You can do as you choose. If you reject the offer, you will never get anything, for the woman has friends who will convey her and her children out of the country." That's probably true. Harriet Jacobs, because the Underground Railroad was had such infrastructure in place now, Harriet Jacobs could have pretty easily, especially from as far north as Boston, but even from New York City and or upstate New York, she could have easily escaped Canada and solved this problem. But Mr. Dodge accepts the $300. She says, Mr. Dodge concluded that half a loaf was better than no bread. He agreed to the proffered terms. And Harriet and Mrs. Bruce, who employs Harriet Jacobs, buys her freedom. My brain reeled as I read these lines. A gentleman near me said, "It's true, I've seen the bill of sale." The bill of sale, these words struck me like a blow. I was sold at last, a human being sold in the free city of New York. And so Mrs. Bruce buys her freedom. She is free. She gets to go back to New York City. I had objected to having my freedom bought, yet I must confess that when it was done, I felt as if a heavy load had been lifted from my weary shoulders. She's obviously relieved. She can go home. She's truly free now. When I reached home, the arms of my benefactress were thrown around me. Our tears mingled. My heart was exceedingly full. I remembered how my poor father had tried to buy me when I was a small child. My relatives had been foiled in all their efforts, but God had raised me up a friend among strangers who bestowed on me the precious, long-desired boon. My grandmother lived to rejoice in my freedom, but not long after, a letter came with a black seal. She had gone where the wicked cease from troubling, and the weary are at rest. And so at the end of the book, she tells you her grandmother has died. Her Uncle Philip, who built the hiding place in the attic for her, passes away. And then she comes back in the last two paragraphs of the book. She circles you back to that same domestic fiction appealing to women, especially white women who might be reading this book. Reader, my story ends with freedom, not in the usual way with marriage. And so she says, like, I got a happy ending, but it's not the traditional happy ending that you get in stories about women where they get married, they fall in love, they have a home and children. I and my children are now free. We're as free from the power of slaveholders as are the white people of the North. I do not sit with my children in a home of my own. I still long for a hearthstone of my own. She says, like, I still wish I could at least have my own home, have my own children with me, but I haven't got that yet. But I'm blessed to be working for this person who helped me help my family. And then you get that last chapter. It has been painful for me in many ways to recall the dreary years I passed in bondage. I would gladly forget them if I could. She's like, thinking back to this, it's really unpleasant. But at least I got to remember my grandmother. Tender memories of my good grandmother, like light fleecy clouds. And that gives you the end. But that next to last paragraph is really important because she, like I said, circles you back to this sort of domestic fiction, writing by women for women. And it almost always plays into the common stereotypes of what women were expected to want and sort of aspire to. Purity until you find the love of your life, and then you've been saving yourself for them, and then you get marriage, and then you get a home of your own to start a family. And she says, look, I haven't got that. I hope I get it sometime. But slavery held that back from me. A lot of what she comes back to over and over again is writing towards that sort of domestic fiction idea that I wanted these things that women are supposed to stereotypically, traditionally want, but they were withheld from me. They were poisoned by the poison of slavery. And she circles you back to that right here at the end and says, like, I'm closer to it than I ever was. I'm free. I'm here with my children, or at least her daughter. And I'm still aiming towards like my own home, my own hearth of my own. So it's significant that she, even at the end of the book, brings you back to that sort of like that domestic fiction framework. I hope that helps you understand the second half of the book, and really the biggest moments in the second half of this book. The birth of her daughter, and then the 7 years of hiding in the attic, and then her finally being truly free because her freedom is bought by the woman that she works for. whose name was Cornelia Willis in real life. She gets called Mrs. Bruce in the book, obviously. Hope that's useful to you. Hope you're doing well.